Hello everyone, welcome back to Butterworthy. I am, as always, Jamie Butterworth. I spent the last 3 days working on a script to make a video for you guys, to make this video for you guys. Now at this point, I grabbed a beer, a good one, because I don't drink piss water, snuggled up under a blanket, strapped on my headset, and I suggest you buckle in as well. Now, Cracked.com put up an article entitled 5 Reasons the Video Game Industry is About to Crash. And I found it to be a pretty compelling article that completely backs up the thought process that I've had for months now. We're not just going to go over this article, which you'll find a link for in the description, but I'm going to explain to you how Nintendo is going to come out smelling like roses on the other end of this. I don't know how familiar you are with Cracked. They post articles regularly that are entitled things like 5 myths about prostitutes I believed until I was one, and 7 unbelievable things you've never heard about planets. No one would accuse them of being high journalism, but their articles are brilliant and always interesting. This one was written by a current game developer who also previously worked on MMOs, so let's dig in. Now, reason number 5, we put people who don't know gaming in charge. The standout paragraph under this reason, for me, comes after he explains that due to the nature of the industry, CEOs and executives with zero games experience end up making creative decisions. Now he goes on to say, the result is that the gaming industry is driven by aphorisms. For example, it's an entrenched belief that the only truly successful games are branded titles, sequels, and reboots. That's what the reports tell him. So what I found was that there was a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy at work. I was once told point blank by a non-gamer CEO that there's no market for sci-fi games in a certain genre. At the time, fantasy games dominated that market, and who's to say he was wrong? When was switching from fantasy to sci-fi ever worked out? Now there's a big fat picture of StarCraft right under that paragraph. There's no arguing with this point. You know it, I know it, and everyone but the corporate suits know it. You've got people who know nothing about games and only stare at numbers and spreadsheets, making important decisions that impact the games that you and I enjoy. I mean, when games are released unfinished and buggy, who's to blame? Not the programmers, not their creative team. You can bank on some dickbag in a suit rushing these games to market like a newborn calf en route to a veal convention. If you've been paying attention since 1986, the people running Nintendo have always had a vested interest in the games themselves. It's clear that they know which of their franchise characters move the most units, but they focus on providing the smoothest experience in the most rock-solid games. Critical acclaim tends to fall from the sky once they do finally release a polished and finalized game. Not to mention all the money they get showered in with each new Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon release. This is why Iwata is in charge and not the shareholders. The most damning sentence from that entire section: people who have the most experience and actually know what they're doing are basically just polishing the ideas that the execs come up with. You heard it, folks. The people who want to provide great games to us are simply left to polish turds. Now, reason number 4. Budgets have gone insane, and that's making innovation almost impossible. Now, I want to read this whole section to you, but I'm going to try and hold it down to a couple of paragraphs. He gives us an example of how game budgets work, saying, let's say you've been put in charge of planning a child's birthday party. For some reason, maybe you lost a bet or something. You've got one day to plan, a $50 budget, and 5 people to help you. Not a big deal, right? Put some balloons in the yard, hire a clown, done. But what if that party was for a rich kid and your budget was $50 million? Do you think that makes it easier or harder? Let's put it this way. Instead of 5 friends helping you, it's 500 strangers, and all of them have different ideas about what a party should look like. How long until you see your first fist fight break out? How far into the party before you hear yourself scream, okay, who hired the stripper? As an aside here, I was the one that ordered the stripper. But he continues, well, in the world of game development, this change from small-scale projects to massive productions happened overnight. The average game costs freaking 30 times as much as it did in the days of the original Sony PlayStation. Back then, the average game could be made for $800,000 on the low end. But by PlayStation 3 area, that number had ballooned to $28 million. With the new consoles, that's going up again. Now, and to quote one more paragraph from him, not that it's easier on their end, remember, it's not just the development that's changing so fast, it's the distribution as well. Today, studios are competing in a market that's permanently saturated by $3 indie games on Steam, and the nostalgia-driven goodoldgames.com. Time-honored marketing strategies don't work anymore, and the industry is struggling to find a replacement. Even though it feels like prices have gone up, if you take inflation into account, right now games are the cheapest they've ever been. Add it all up, and most studios are one failed game away from bankruptcy. Game budgets spiraling out of control is well known to us right now. Capcom, Square, and THQ can tell you more about that than anyone else. I'm almost expecting to wake up any day, check the news, here's where I plug PlayerEssence.com by the way, and see yet another entrenched industry stalwart has gone out of business. During this part of the article, he also makes the point that even though the industry feels saturated with first-person shooters and rehashes, their sales are necessary to the health of the industry right now. I mean, if the Call of Duties and Maddens of the world didn't continue to move all these units each year, then the industry would have been fucked long ago. So let's look over at Nintendo. I can honestly say I don't know how much they spend on game development, but I'm sure it's a pretty penny. Honestly, you can look at the sales for their first-party releases and rest assured that they more than make it all back. Their fat stash of Scrooge McDuck-like cash is proof of that. Do you think Iwata and Reggie take turns diving into it like the giant money vault from DuckTales? Nintendo just released a remake of Wind Waker on the Wii U that took about 6 months for them to develop. How much do you think they dropped on the development? I'll tell you this, for a game that's already moved over 500,000 physical units, an untold amount of digital sales, and likely hundreds of thousands of systems, it was worth every penny. It's clear that they're at the very least quite efficient in how they develop games. Reason number 3. Publishers are gaming the review system. We already know this, but he makes a few points here that I want to highlight. He states, raise your hand if you've paid $60 for a heavily promoted game that got near perfect review scores, only to find it to be a frustrating cookie-cutter mess that had you doing a mental inventory of all the things you could have bought with that cash instead. Did the critics, get a different version or something? No, the system is set up so that big games rarely get the scores they deserve. This is a huge problem from the consumer end. Games are a much bigger time and money investment than movies, books, or any other media. So having honest reviews you can rely on is crucial. You're trying to get an opinion on what might be the only game you buy for the next couple of months. But it's becoming increasingly apparent that critic scores and user scores just don't sync up. Call of Duty Ghosts currently has a score of 74 on Metacritic. Not a fantastic score for a AAA game with that kind of budget, but check out the average user score, 2.3. Now he goes on to point out how publishers often will butter up their reviewers by granting exclusive interviews, or hands-on time with games, or other perks. I mean, if a game gets a good review from a site with an interesting and quotable blurb, it can even make it on the cover of the game, thus driving traffic for the website. If a reviewer speaks negatively about games, the companies will pull ads, or you won't get any more exclusive content from them. It's not that these companies are directly paying reviewers, but the companies are effectively blackmailing them. Do what I say, or I'm going to hurt your bottom line. No matter which way you cut it, that's blackmail. And you and I are the ones that pay for it, both literally and figuratively. How does Nintendo avoid this pitfall? Simple. They don't engage in it. Though there's no definitive evidence, I feel that the amount of never-ending doom and gloom articles for the company, as well as reviews that accurately rate their games, are solid proof. Think about that. When was the last time there was an overrated Nintendo game? Not to mention that user scores often match or exceed their review scores. So I decided to do some quick research to illustrate this point. Are you ready for this? Bear in mind, there's a lot of these, so bear with me for a minute while I read these off to you. Now, first of all, we've got Nintendo. Super Mario 3D World scored a 94 with a user score of 8.9. Wind Waker, 90 with a user score of 8.7. Pikmin 3, 87, user score 8.5. New Super Mario U, 84 with a user score of 8.0. Lego City Undercover, 80 with a score of 7.9. Wonderful 101, 78 and an 8.3. Nintendo Land, 77 and a 7.7. Zombie U, 77, and a 7.5. Let's look at PlayStation 2. Uncharted 2, 96, user score of 8.7. Little Big Planet, 95, with a user score of 6.7. Last of Us, 95 with a user score of 9.1. Metal Gear Solid 4, 94 with a user score of 8.7. Uncharted 3, 92, user score 8.3. Killzone 2, 91 with a user score of 8.1. Now the list goes on and on with those type of examples, but are you ready for the Xbox before we get to the most egregious offenders? Gears of War, 94 with a user score of 8.3. Halo 3, 94 with a user score of 7.7. Forza 3, 92 with a user score of 7.9. Halo Reach, 91 with a user score of 7.7. Gears of War 3, 91 and a 7.6. Fable 2, 89 with a user score of 6.4. Xbox isn't the strongest system for exclusives, so let's highlight a serious problem here. Third parties. Grand Theft Auto 4. You knew this was going to be the first one up. 98 Metacritic score with a user score of 7.9. Grand Theft Auto 5. 97 with a user score of 8.1. Skyrim. There was a pretty big difference here. 96 on Xbox. 92 on PS3. Now remember, we've talked on the Gamers at Large podcast a bit about how broken the PS3 version was, and it got a 92 from the critics. Now on Xbox, the user score is 8.4. PS3, 6.0. Bioshock Infinite, 94 with a user score of 8.4. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, 94 with a user score of 6.1. Mass Effect 3, 93 with a user score of 5.6. The last 4 years of FIFA are rated 88 or above, but user scores are 7.6 at the highest and 6.0 at the lowest. The games industry is pissing on us and calling it rain. This is why I trust Nintendo games to provide the experiences I expect from video games, and why they're the only company that produces systems I buy on day one. Number 2. You're flying blind. This is something I didn't think much about until I read the article. Now the author states, every gamer has had the experience of seeing some amazing preview trailers for a game set to come out a year or so later, only to have the game arrive and look nothing like that preview, although some are worse than others. You may ask yourself, why they're allowed to get away with that? Isn't it false advertising? Or fraud? After all, don't these game makers know what their final product is going to look like? No, we don't. In fact, it's almost impossible to know. Why? Well, think about your hypothetical child's birthday party earlier. Imagine going through that hectic process, only to find that guest list change about once an hour. Suddenly you have to accommodate more kids. The backyard you plan to use isn't big enough. The one clown you hired won't be enough to terrify all of them, so you change your plans, some of which means redoing work you've already done. Then an hour later, it changes again. This time, it's not just more kids, but different kids. Some of them have peanut allergies. Each little change means you have to completely rethink what you're doing. I honestly don't have much to say here. I mean, had I purchased Alien Colonial Marines, I'm sure I could write a book on it. However, I don't have a point of reference for this point since the games I anticipate typically end up looking and playing like I expect. As for Nintendo, it's not like they show up to large trade shows with computers. With computers running approximate specs with target visuals, like some companies. Number 1. The industry is extremely exploitive, and it's driving away talent. I can't speak from personal experience on this one, so let me share the entirety of the author's point, which is fairly short. I'm not exaggerating when I say that, for the vast majority of studios in the gaming industry, working conditions are awful, and the burnout rate is pandemic. The frantic period before a game releases is called crunch time, and it's marked by 60 to 80-hour weeks, and crunch time can last up to a year. No, it's not as bad as a job as the guy that has to crawl with a constipated elephant's butt at the zoo, but it's bad enough that it's hurting the games. The best and brightest veterans get driven away. It's easy to see why. Around your late 20s and early 30s, most people are looking to settle down and start a family. That means a stable, secure job that doesn't demand 12-hour workdays plus weekends, with no overtime and the looming threat of layoffs after the project ships. Producers and programmers can easily work on commercial software for banks and oil companies, and designers can easily transition to anything related to front-end user experience. And in both cases, they'll be making way more money for way less work. So the game industry is exporting experienced game developers while importing businessmen with no game experience to oversee the starry-eyed, inexperienced juniors who remain. The only ones who tend to stay behind are the artists, because they're stuck with highly specialized skills, like animating boobs, which skews the industry expertise in that direction. The result of all of this isn't that games are going away, it's just that the industry may look very different a few years from now. That might not be a bad thing. Now, how the industry will look just 5 years from now? That's my question. When you see longtime industry stalwarts like Capcom and Square on the brink of financial ruin, and when a giant publisher like THQ folds, obviously there are serious problems. I'm very concerned that Capcom could fold at any time. They just had a, excuse the pun, monster hit with Monster Hunter 4, but they decided to invest the profits of that into a new studio dedicated to making mobile games. Bear in mind that it was a $50 million in profits, which is roughly a third of the cash they had on hand just a few months ago. Mobile profits are razor thin, and that's also a market with an impending collapse. But that's a discussion for another time. Square may run into another issue like they did back in the NES days. Why is Final Fantasy named that? Because the first Final Fantasy was Square's last hope of making it in the gaming industry. I fear it may come down to that again. The RPG Titan doesn't pump out the quality that it used to, and like Capcom, it has only itself to blame. They've cozied up to Western developers in an attempt to emulate their business models, and ignored the fact that a large majority of Western game developers fold quicker than a cheap Taiwanese hooker. What about a company like EA? Their business practices and half-assed, bug-filled games, not to mention their lackluster and flagging sports series, may be their undoing before much longer. I'm certain they have an incredible war chest, but one too many flops and enough pissed-off customers can do very real damage. Activision has Blizzard to prop them up if things start to go south, but even that gravy train may end if they can't reinvigorate World of Warcraft or release a new MMO to replace it. Call of Duty has seen much of its fanbase erode this year, and that series will honestly be best served with taking a year off, or maybe two. But the ugly parts of capitalism rear its head when the shareholders and investors demand Call of Duty continue the annual releases. I fear that it will be run into the ground much like Guitar Hero and Tony Hawk, if it hasn't already. On the hardware front, Microsoft is the most likely to drop out. The Xbox division has never turned a profit, and Microsoft's investors aren't blind to it anymore. You can only hide the losses for so long before it catches up to you. The sales of the Xbox One in the next year and the selection of their next CEO are going to be telling. An interesting twist to this would be if Microsoft sells off the Xbox division, which is then bought up by Sega to bring themselves back into the market. Sega and Microsoft have always been close since the Dreamcast. That system ran on a Microsoft architecture, and Microsoft emulated much from Sega's camp with the original Xbox, adopting Sega's forward-thinking attitude with online play. It didn't hurt that Peter Moore jumped ship from Sega to Microsoft after the Dreamcast died. Want to see startling comparisons for yourself? Look at the design of the Sega Saturn analog controller compared to the original fat Xbox controller. Then look at the button colors and layout of the Dreamcast controller versus the Xbox controller. Microsoft did everything in their power to pick up where Sega left off. Then you've got Sony and Nintendo. I'm certain both of these companies would survive the crash, and I know Nintendo would thrive in the post-crash environment. The PS4 is a clear success already, and their in-house development studios can carry them if third parties start crumbling. And their openness towards indie devs doesn't hurt either. Sony has had its fair share of financial troubles, and the failure of the Vita isn't helping things, but I'm confident in their ability to continue on in the face of adversity. The PS3 taught them valuable lessons, and it seems that they truly have their head on straight. I think the Vita also taught them a few lessons, the least of which is to stay the hell out of the handheld market. If they want to go mobile, they should stick with the Ericsson brand. If you're going to go against Nintendo in the mobile gaming space, you've got to support your handheld with all you've got, not half-ass it, and then market it as a peripheral when things go south. Lastly, Nintendo will continue with business as usual. If numerous companies start folding, they may open up their massive wallet to secure a few select IPs. Capcom goes down, expect them to buy at least Mega Man and Monster Hunter. It's possible they could even grab Resident Evil since the series has a long history on Nintendo platforms. If Square goes down, they can make a play for Kingdom Hearts, but Final Fantasy is likely something that Sony would drop big bucks for. But Nintendo themselves are such an efficient machine in the gaming industry that I would be shocked if they were at all impacted by a gaming crash. Their business practices aren't the same as the rest of the industry. They already make quality games. They understand their fan base, and they have the most well-known and sought-after IPs. Hell, Mario is more recognizable than Mickey Mouse at this point. I have no doubt that gaming is heading for a collapse. I've been saying it for months on end, and I've even speculated this generation will be the last of traditional consoles. Only time will tell what's going to happen, but it's all a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. Thanks for sticking around for all that, guys. I appreciate each and every one of you. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.